Greetings, my fellow freedom-loving sovereign thinkers. Thank you for tuning to LL3 Podcast. My name is Craig, transmitting from the wild, wonderful Mountain State. And today's date is Tuesday, August 10th, 2021. Yes, it is late Tuesday night. Just had to do a couple of errands here and there. Listen to a couple of collect information on what's going on. Of course, a lot of the news stations are focused on the resignation of New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, and it looks like the Democrats in that own state are focusing on the sexual harassment. And what I've examined so far, very unmerited, with all due respect. Of course, the mob justice mentality, guilty till proven innocent, is a very nefarious habit, and it's been going on in other cases. And all you gotta do is examine it, and you understand. It's just real turn off. And you talk to a person who's not lovey-dovey of Governor Cuomo as a politician. I'll just leave it at that. I never met the man in person, so I can't make any judgment. But his actions as an elected servant is a very, I would say, censured attributes, condemned. So no hatred towards the man. His actions are unacceptable. Still the question about the 15,000 deaths that was under his watch of the elderly nursing homes that had COVID patients going to these nursing homes. So that's a big red flag, and many of the people in that state, especially New York City, haven't forgotten it. So and it's great too what's going on in the Big Apple. People protesting against mask mandates, the vaccinations. And this is why, I tell everybody, there's some good folks everywhere you go. They're not all bad people. So you always get your pros and cons. But it doesn't mean the people there are idiots. So always admire that gumption they're having in that state, in that city. And everyone should be liberty-minded. And let them know that, hey, you're nothing without us. You got a bunch of people in government believe they're smarter than everyone else. And it doesn't work that way. You got the power to tell them to stick it. Out of principle. So, I just had a dull moment there. Well, enough said. This one just came out 5 hours ago from the Mises Institute, Mises.org, under their wire. The Great Keynesian Coup of August 1971, 50 years later. Let's see what Mr. William Anderson has to say. On August 15th, 1971, the last remains of what had been magnificent monetary system died a terrible death, and the American academic, political, business, and media elites led the cheers. The Dow Jones average jumped by more than 32 points the next day. A de facto national default was spun as a great liberation from the tyrannical financial arrangement that had plagued humanity for generations. A half a century later, the disinformation continues as intellectual bankruptcy parallels the financial bankruptcy of that event. I write, of course, of the decision by President Richard Nixon to officially close the gold window through which the U.S. government was obligated to sell its gold stores to foreign governments at $35 an ounce, which even then was a bargain, as Nixon's regime encouraged the Federal Reserve System to inflate the dollar to pay for its bloated military and welfare spending, as had the Johnson and Kennedy regimes before him. It became apparent that the US dollar was quickly losing value, the United States was in a rapid decline, and the dollar was falling with the nation's prestige. What happened? There are several accounts, and I will give the main ones ending with the Austrian perspective. The first will be the Keynesian, the second, monetarist Chicago School, third, the supply side version, and the fourth from the Austrians. Before doing that, however, I will give a brief account of the events that began with the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 and ended in national disgrace and ignominy that even now the official American narrative refuses to recognize. The Bretton Woods Conference didn't occur in a vacuum. Just a month before, Allied troops had secured the beachhead in France and had begun to slowly push the German army eastward. Across the European continent, armies of the Soviet Union were slowly destroying the Axis forces from the other direction. In the Pacific, U.S. bombers were beginning to lay waste to Japanese cities, and the Japanese armies were suffering defeat after defeat. The final victory for the U.S. and its allies would not come for another 13 months, but even in July 1944, it was clear how the war would end. The U.S. State Department explains the stated purpose of the conference to help reestablish trading relations in the post-war world. The lessons taken by U.S. policymakers from the interwar period informed the institutions created at the conference. Officials such as Franklin D. Roosevelt and Secretary of State Cordell Hull were adherents of the Wilsonian belief that free trade not only promoted international prosperity, but also international peace. The experience of the 1930s certainly suggested as much. The policies adopted by governments to combat the Great Depression, high tariff barriers, competitive currency devaluations, discriminatory trading blocs, had contributed to creating an unstable international environment without improving the economic situation. This experience led national leaders to conclude that the economic cooperation was the only way to achieve both peace and prosperity at home and abroad. Some cynicism can be excused if one sees a disconnect between the high-minded rhetoric of the document and the actual policies of the Wilson and Roosevelt administrations that played a major role in creating the calamities from 1917 to the end of World War II. But then it is a rare occurrence when government bombast the truth intersect. Not surprisingly, Bretton Woods was an attempt by governments to deal with the precious disastrous results of intervention by imposing even more intervention. In his classic, What Has Government Done to Our Money?, Murray and Rothbard, who will figure heavily in my interpretation of the August 15th events, describe the Bretton Woods Agreement. The Bretton Woods system worked far better than the disaster of the 1930s. It worked only as another inflationary recrudescence of the gold exchange standard of the 1920s and the likes of the 1920s. The system lived only on borrowed time. The new system was essentially the gold exchange standard of the 1920s, but with the dollar rudely displacing the British pound as one of the key currencies. Now the dollar, valued at 1/35th of a gold ounce, was to be the only key currency. The other difference in the 1920s was that the dollar was no longer redeemable in gold to American citizens. Instead, the 1930s system was continued. With the dollar redeemable in gold only to foreign governments and their central banks, no private individuals, only governments were allowed the privilege of redeeming the dollars in the world gold currency. In the Bretton Woods system, the United States pyramided dollars in paper money and in bank deposits on top of gold, in which dollars could be redeemed by foreign governments, while all other governments held dollars in their basic reserve and pyramided their currency on top of dollars. That was page 99, by the way. Okay, so to put it another way, when Bretton Woods Agreement really was a scheme to give the appearance of sound money, all while ensuring that the sound money regime that existed prior to the outbreak of World War I would not be reinstituted. Furthermore, Henry Hazlitt who then was writing editorials for the New York Times, How the Mighty Have Fallen, saw through everything and predicted that the new monetary arrangements would lead to disastrous consequences. He wrote, the greatest contribution to the United States could make to world currency stability after the war is to announce its determination to stabilize its own currency. It will incidentally help us, of course, if other nations as well return to the gold standard, they will do it. However, only to the extent that they recognize that they are doing it not primarily as a favor to us, but to themselves. But Hazlitt knew that governments in 1944 were institutionally incapable of returning to sound money, and that the elites in government, academia, and the media were hostile to anything but fiat money. Ultimately, Hazlitt and the NYT would part ways over his disagreements with the Keynesian economic views of the era. The NYT would continue to endorse money socialism, and today features Paul Krugman, who has all but endorsed the printing of modern monetary theory. In other words, Hazlitt predicted the demise of the Bretton Woods Accord 27 years before it officially collapsed. As previously noted, the U.S. dollar was set as the world reserve currency, and it was set at $35 per ounce of gold, which meant that foreign governments and central banks could purchase the gold at that price if they wished to redeem their dollars on something other than dollar-denominated goods and assets. Rothbard points out that because the agreement set the currency exchange values at pre-war levels, the dollar was undervalued and European currencies overvalued, thus increasing the demand for dollars. For reasons of length, I do not cover the Marshall Plan and how international monetary policies fit into trying to make it work. Suffice to say, the Marshall Plan has been given far too much credit for Europe's post-war recovery. In many instances, it actually impeded recovery, and it was only after the governments of Western European nations eased the economic controls set during Nazi occupation that Europe had a true economic recovery. The purpose of devaluing the U.S. dollar provided incentives for the Federal Reserve System to inflate the dollar, which it did in the post-war years and beyond, and is doing with a vengeance today. Because the law forbade Americans from buying and owning gold, with some exceptions for jewelry and official coin collections, the U.S. government did not have to worry about its inflationary policies creating a domestic run on its gold reserves. That would not be the case overseas, however. American economists and politicians embrace Keynesian theories that emphasize expansive government programs financed through deficit spending. The few dissenters, such as economists Ludwig von Mises and F.A. Hayek, were dismissed as mossbacks and reactionaries, as the American media, academic, and political establishment saw the new economics as a gateway to easy prosperity. European governments, and especially the French government led by Charles de Gaulle, who was advised by the classical standard economist Jacques Rueff, by the 1960s began to purchase U.S. gold in earnest. In the early post-war years, it made sense to hold officially undervalued dollars, but in less than 2 decades, the dollar has become hopelessly overvalued relative to most European currencies. Lyndon's Vietnam War and his Great Society welfare programs had to be financed, and the government chose inflation. Buying gold at what was a bargain price was a way that foreign governments could do an end run around monetary exchange system that was becoming increasingly unbalanced. In 1968, the U.S. government tried to put together a stopgap measure to stop the gold hemorrhage. Rothbard goes into details of the measures, noting that they were doomed to fail because they were based upon faulty economic analysis. By trying to sever the link between the U.S. dollar and gold sold on the free market, the Johnson administration claimed that the new measures would force down the price of gold to less than $35 an ounce, making U.S. stores an unattractive buy. As any competent Austrian economist would predict, however, the runs on U.S. gold did not diminish, but rather intensified. And by the summer of 1971, the U.S. economy was stagnant, prices were rising, and President Nixon on August 15th announced his Phase 1 economic plan of price controls and temporarily closing the gold window. Again, any competent economist would know that this move would end in failure, but the move initially was popular in the media and with the public. Gene Healy writes, there was no national emergency in the summer of 1971. Unemployment stood at 6%. Yet, after Nixon's announcement, the markets rallied, the press swooned, and even though his speech preempted the popular Western Bonanza, the people loved it too. 75% backed the plan in the polls. It tells you a lot of folks didn't have a damn clue, right? Of course. On the monetary side, the next step was the implementation in December of the Smithsonian Agreement, which was raise the official price of U.S. government gold to $38 an ounce and allow some flexibility in the fixed exchange rate. But in the end, the combination of U.S. inflation and economic stagnation on the home front would lead to a total collapse of fixed rates. By 1973, the dollar was hopelessly overvalued, and ultimately the present system of floating exchange rates prevailed. Keynesian policies. One of the most famous statements to come from this episode of Nixon's shock was the president's statement to his advisors, "We are all Keynesians now." It also was the most accurate statement anyone in the government would make. In one action, Nixon cut ties to gold, what James M. Kenneth had called that barbarous relic. The devaluation of the dollar would help exports, and Nixon saw government intervention as necessary to balance power between labor unions and corporations. In fact, U.S. Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns already announced his fealty to Keynesian economics, and Nixon himself has surrendered any previous notions of free markets to the Keynesian-inspired policies. The PBS Commanding Heights series reported, whatever the effects of the Vietnam War on the national consensus in the 1960s, confidence has risen in the ability of government to manage the economy and to reach out to solve big social problems through such programs as the War on Poverty. Nixon shared in these beliefs, at least in part. "Now I am a Keynesian," he declared in January 1971, leaving his aides from, to draft replies to the angry letters that flowed into the White House from conservative supporters. He introduced a Keynesian full employment budget, which provided for deficit spending to reduce unemployment. A U.S. congressman from Illinois told Nixon that he would reluctantly support the president's budget, but I'm going to have to burn up a lot of old speeches denouncing deficit spending. To this, Nixon replied, "I am in the same boat." Whatever the fiscal discipline Nixon had promised during his political campaign was out the window. Even his enemies in the academic and political worlds, and they were legion, would always hate him. Nonetheless, he was giving them what they always had wanted: government control of the economy. Not surprisingly, while his policies were politically popular at the beginning, the 1970s ultimately became known as for stagflation. Simultaneously increases in unemployment and inflation, something Keynesian claimed was impossible, gasoline and natural gas shortages due to price control, and a general feeling of despair. Democrats ultimately would drive Nixon from office 3 years later, but they endorsed his economic policies and especially his penchant for price controls. So he's our patsy. We'll just toss him under the bus. President Jimmy Carter would push his wage price guidelines in an unsuccessful attempt to bring down the double-digit inflation. And when Senator Ted Kennedy ran for a Democratic nomination in 1980, he made price controls the centerpiece of his economic policies. Ironically, Carter and the Democrats did embark on a supply-side venture of their own, deregulating the financial and transportation sectors and laying the groundwork to deregulate telecommunications. Thus, the party of the New Deal actually undid part of the legacy of Franklin Roosevelt and actually provided a long-run boost to the economy, all while being ignorant of their accomplishments. Of course, it's traditional, it's politics, right? Precisely. And supply-siders. Well, the group of economists that call themselves supply-siders raised important issues about how government intervention in the economy was causing stagflation and other economic ills. Nonetheless, their statements on Nixon's actions were short-sighted. During the 1980 presidential campaign, in which Ronald Reagan cast his lot with the supply-side economics, Jack Kemp, who championed the supply-side policies in Congress, declared that Nixon's era had been to go to floating exchange rates instead of holding to the fixed rates of the Bretton Woods Accord. Nixon's actions, as dishonest as they were, did not occur in a vacuum. Holding to fixed exchange rates and a very modified gold standard would have required the kind of fiscal and monetary discipline that had not existed in Washington since the Great Depression, and certainly was not going to begin in August 1971. We should be clear. Nixon did not unilaterally destroy a productive arrangement. Nixon's actions unwittingly exposed the bankruptcy of the United States U.S. government policies, even though he would spin it as the U.S. fending off an unjustified foreign attack on the dollar and on U.S. gold supplies. During the era of the International Gold Standard that fell apart in 1914, currency rates were fixed, but not against each other, but rather to a measure of gold. Any attempts to game the system, as the U.S. government did on a regular basis in the post-war years, would have quickly been detected, with gold outflows immediately helping to counter cheating. Although the Bretton Woods Accord was created to emulate the old gold standard with its fixed rates, it ultimately failed because governments are destructive. By the summer's end of 1914, the government of Europe had gone to war and destroyed an international gold standard that took decades to build. In 1971, governments armed with Keynesian dogma laid waste to an economic system almost as surely as the guns of August brought Western civilization to its knees. Yes, it did. Monetarist. Well, Nixon announced the imposition of wage and price controls. Milton Friedman of the University of Chicago loudly denounced them as an utter failure. However, as Rothbard wrote, Friedman was not happy to see the last rights of the dollar to gold broken. An outspoken advocate of floating fiat exchange rates, Friedman for years had denounced gold ties to the dollar, as Rothbard explains. Since the United States was completely off gold in August 1971 and established the Friedmanite fluctuating fiat system in March 1973, the United States and the world have suffered the most intense and most sustained bout of peacetime inflation in the history of the world. It should be clear by now that it is scarcely a coincidence. Before the dollar was cut loose from gold, Keynesians and Friedmanites, that's how I pronounce it, each in their own way devoted to fiat paper money, confidently predicted that when fiat money was established, the market price of gold would fall promptly to its non-monetary level, then estimated at about $8 an ounce. In their scorn of gold, both groups maintained that it was the mighty dollar that was propping up the price of gold, not vice versa. Since 1971, the market price of gold has never been below the old fixed price of $35 an ounce. It has always been enormously higher. That's from pages 109, 110. In Freeman's defense, the floating exchange rates didn't cause the inflation of the 1970s. However, those floating rates imposed no financial discipline on the U.S. government. And when things were South presidential administrations blamed foreign governments, when the dollar fell against European currencies in 1978, President Carter signed off on a scheme in which the Federal Reserve System underwrote a massive purchase of dollars in order to prop up the currency. Not surprisingly, the arrangement failed to strengthen the dollar over time. Yep, when you play with fiat money and banksters and government knows best, it turns to manure, right? Absolutely. Austrians. While the Keynesians and monetarists might look down on gold as money for any monetary ties to gold, Austrians are not afraid to face the ridicule from elites. More than anyone else, however, Austrians such as Rothbard understood completely what was happening in 1971, and they were not fooled by the government's various monetary tricks as were others. Rothbard writes, all pro-paper economists from Keynesians to Freedom Knights were not confident that gold would disappear from the international monetary system. Cut off from its support by the dollar, these economists all confidently predicted the free market gold price would soon fall below $35 an ounce and even down to the estimate industrial non-monetary gold price of $10 an ounce. Instead, the free price of gold, never below $35, had been steadily above $35 and by early 1973 had climbed around $125 an ounce, a figure that no pro-paper economists would have thought possible as recently as a year earlier. Far from establishing a permanent new monetary system, the two-tier gold market only brought a few years of time. American inflation and deficits continued. Eurodollars are accumulated rapidly. Gold continued to flow outward, and the higher free market price of gold simply revealed the accelerated loss of world confidence in the dollar. That's pages 104 to 105. The U.S. economy and the dollar rebounded in the 1980s in part because of lower tax rates and in part of the regulatory efforts instituted by the Carter administration. Unfortunately, the favorable economic conditions did not lead to fiscal soundness, but instead seemed to encourage even more reckless behavior in Washington. For the last 22 years, the economy has seen one financial bubble after another. First, the tech bubble of the late 1990s and the housing bubble that burst in 2008, and now a combination of housing and equities seems to be rising as well out of sync with market fundamentals. As they did in 1971, the elite economists of our day are the cheerleaders for fiscal foolishness. Lest one believe I'm exaggerating, this is from a recent column by Paul Krugman in the New York Times, which lost its way editorially after the editorial leadership pushed out Henry Hazlitt endorsing the so-called infrastructure bill. Krugman writes, imagine to see a round number that the federal government were to go outright and borrow $1 trillion and that it were to do so without making any provision for servicing the additional debt. That is, it wouldn't raise any taxes or cut any spending to pay off the principal. It wouldn't even do anything to cover interest payments, simply borrowing more money as interest came due. Under these circumstances, the debt will grow over time, but it wouldn't grow very fast. The current interest rates on long-term U.S. debt is less than 1.2%. So after a decade, the debt would have only risen about 13%, and the debt growth would vastly outpace by growth in the economy. The Congressional Budget Office projects a 50% rise in dollar GDP over the next 10 years. Debt wouldn't snowball relative to the economy, it would melt. So the fact that the infrastructure bill would in practice pay for public investment with borrowed money isn't anything to worry about. If the investment is worth undertaking, and it is, we should just do it. One can imagine that Krugman would have championed Nixon's moves from abrogating the Bretton Woods Agreement to impose wage and price controls to a Keynesian like Krugman and those that came before him. The economy works best when government spends recklessly with no constraints. Austrians know better. The collapse of the monetary order in 1971 reflected the massive dislocations and malinvestment of resources that ultimately turned the decade into one crisis after another, and the current economy is facing a risk even greater magnitude. Unfortunately, Keynesians rule the day just as they did 50 years ago, as Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, hope I pronounced his name correctly, wrote of the Bourbons in the years after the French Revolution. They learned nothing, they forgot nothing. One can say the same for the Keynesians. Half a century after the crisis, Keynesians seem hell-bent on creating new crises and printing money to fix them. Micro solutions to mega problems. He's absolutely correct. One of the areas you always got to look at, folks, fiat money, it is dangerous. The founding fathers of the United States gave those warnings at their Constitution Convention, because they remember what happened in the food riots in Philadelphia during the War on Independence. The money just, they print money out in there, and boom, it skyrocketed. If you study more disasters of fiat money, fall of the Reichsmark in the 1920s, after the Roman republics tried to pay their restitution. You started printing money out in there in 1922, the banksters. All right. 6 years, complete bust. All hell broke loose. That's how Hitler got into power. That's how the Nazis took advantage of it. And of course, Hitler called out the bankers. Many of them were considered Jews. And they've been ostracized in those departments. And I'm not saying what happened afterwards for all the other innocent people that were tortured, slaughtered, and so forth. I'm not condoning that at all. It's always a ramification of cause and effect. We gotta learn all sides the best we can. It's just another disturbing example. Same thing happened in Argentina, and multiple other places, even Zimbabwe. Fiat money is dangerous. I'll be very frank. All these folks that support fiat money and so forth, and the Federal Reserve, as far as I'm concerned, they should be charged for treason. Okay? Because they're trying to shut this whole world down. It's just their example of the Great Reset. The Keynesian economics is nothing more than a monumental deception. Sound money is the way to go. Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution guarantees that. In Section 10, the states can use gold and silver as transactions, not paper money. And you can thank the Keynesian Coup, Richard Nixon, everyone else. Doesn't matter about Democrat or Republican, folks. Whether it's red or blue, always prepared, get prepared. Always prepared to get screwed. And that's the truth. And now we're all victims of the Keynesian Coup. All right, that will be it. I thank everyone for listening. Plus, feel free to download and share throughout your social media networks. I know it's a long episode on reading, but it's all well and good. And if you want to send your comments, you could, questions, comments, recommendations, you can send it, please send it with decorum. And if you want to contact me with that, you can go to lookyourluck03@protonmail.com. If you want to donate, go to paypal.me, cash.app/lookyourluck3. If you want to send your donations to the Mises Institute, that would be awesome. Be a member and all that. It's good stuff, very educational. And I always learn something when I read their columns. All right, once again, thank you for your time, but always remember that the demoniac resistance is healthy for the soul and can liberate humanity. Till next time, take care of yourselves. Keep on spreading the love. May your guardian spirits be with you.